The wagon wheel cracked against the dry earth like a gunshot, and the sound was still echoing across the mesa when Grace Ellery looked up and found herself staring down the barrel of a Colt revolver, held by a man she had spent the last 4 hours trying to lose. "Get down from that seat," Marshal Bennett Navarro said, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of voice that didn't need to rise to command a room. He sat his horse like he had been born to it, dark eyes fixed on her with an expression that made her chest tighten against her will. "Now, Miss Ellery, before those riders catch up to what they think is an unguarded woman on a broken wagon." Grace's hands were shaking, though she would have died before admitting it. The afternoon sun was merciless against the red rock country of southern Utah, and the dust the distant riders had kicked up was a brown smear on the horizon, growing larger by the second. She had heard the stories about the Cutter gang. Everyone between Santa Fe and Salt Lake City had heard the stories, but the fear coiling in her stomach had less to do with the men behind her and everything to do with the one in front of her. "You followed me," she said, and her voice came out harder than she intended. 2 days, Marshal. 2 days you have been following my wagon, and I never once asked you to." "No," he agreed, holstering the revolver in one smooth motion that made the gesture look almost casual. "You didn't ask. That's why I'm still doing it." Then he swung down from his horse with practiced ease, and Grace only had 3 seconds to register what was happening before he was beside her wagon, his hands already moving to assess the broken wheel with the focused attention of a man who solved problems the way other men breathed, constantly and without apparent effort. "The Cutter gang has 3 outriders that hit isolated travelers before the main group moves in," he said flatly, not looking up from the wheel. "They took a family 2 weeks ago. I'm not letting them take you." She opened her mouth to tell him she didn't need his protection, that she had made it from Missouri to Utah territory on her own 2 years ago, and she was perfectly capable of making it 60 more miles to Millhaven without a brooding, badge-wearing shadow trailing behind her. But the riders were closer now. She could see them clearly. 4 men on horseback, moving with the unhurried confidence of predators who had already decided the outcome. And Bennett Navarro looked up at her from beside the broken wheel with those dark, unreadable eyes and said quietly, "Trust me or don't, but get down." This was how it had started. 4 days earlier, Grace Ellery had been loading her wagon outside the only general store in the settlement of Redhorn, population 62 on a good day, and she had been doing it with the fierce, efficient determination that characterized everything she did. It was 1879, and she was 27 years old, and she had survived things that would have broken a person with less spine. She had survived the crossing from Missouri. She had survived her husband's death 18 months after they arrived in Utah territory. She had survived 2 years alone on a homestead that the land had never quite wanted to give up to farming, and she had made the decision to sell what remained and move to Millhaven, where her sister Clara lived, and where there was a school that needed a teacher. She was not looking for trouble. She was not looking for company. She was certainly not looking for a man. The crates of preserved food were heavy, and she was wrestling the second one over the wagon's tailgate when she became aware that someone had moved to the other end of the crate without being asked. She looked up sharply and found a stranger helping her lift, a tall man in a dark coat with a Marshal's star pinned to his chest, and the kind of jaw that suggested he had been told no many times in his life and had developed a physical relationship with the word. "I don't need help," she said immediately. "Crate says otherwise," the man replied, and they swung it into the wagon together, and that was the entire extent of their first conversation. She had noticed him, of course. It would have been impossible not to. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 32, with dark hair worn slightly long beneath a battered hat, and a lean, angular face that had been weathered by sun and time into something that stopped just short of beautiful, and arrived instead at something more interesting. He moved with the quiet, contained energy of a man who had learned long ago that drawing attention was a choice, not an inevitability, and he exercised that choice with discipline. His name, she learned from the storekeeper, was Bennett Navarro. He was the marshal assigned to this stretch of Utah territory, which was a vast and frequently violent assignment that he had held for 3 years. He was, the storekeeper told her with the barely suppressed enthusiasm of a man who had very little news to share, originally from New Mexico, the son of a cattle rancher and a schoolteacher, which Grace found privately interesting and would never have admitted to finding interesting. She had driven her wagon out of Redhorn at first light the following morning, and she had not looked back, because looking back had never once helped her. She became aware of him following her approximately 2 hours into the journey, when she noticed the same rider keeping pace roughly half a mile behind, far enough to avoid obvious intrusion but close enough to remain visible. She stopped the wagon. He stopped his horse. She started again. He followed. She debated stopping again and confronting him directly, but the trail ahead was open and she had 60 miles of scrubland and canyon country between herself and Millhaven, and she was not entirely foolish. She was, however, extremely stubborn. When she made camp that first evening beside a dry creek bed, where a few cottonwood trees offered shade, she did not invite him to join her. She built her own fire, cooked her own meal, and performed the entire ritual of making camp with the pointed deliberateness of a woman who wanted it clearly understood that his presence was neither required nor welcomed. He made his own camp perhaps 100 yards away, built his own fire, and left her entirely alone, which should have irritated her less than it did. She lay awake for a long time that first night, listening to the desert settle into darkness around her, the insects and the distant coyotes and the wind moving through the canyon walls, and she thought about the nature of protection and how she had built her entire survival in this territory on the principle of not needing it. She thought about Daniel, her husband, who had been a good man and a weak one and who had died of a fever that took him in 4 days, leaving her with a homestead that was barely breaking even and a loneliness so vast it sometimes felt geographical. She had not cried at his grave. She had been too busy calculating what needed to be done next. She thought about her sister Clara's letters, full of warmth and news about Millhaven, which was a proper town with a church and a courthouse and 300 residents and a school that had been without a teacher for 6 months. She thought about the life she was driving toward. She thought very deliberately about not thinking about the man sleeping 100 yards away. She was not successful. On the second morning she broke camp at dawn, moving efficiently and silently, and she had the wagon moving before the light was fully established. She checked once, briefly, over her shoulder. He was already mounted, already following at that same respectful distance, as if he had anticipated her exact departure time and prepared accordingly. The fact that this did not annoy her as much as it should have was itself annoying. The trail through the canyon country was spectacular and terrible in equal measure. The red and orange cliffs rose hundreds of feet on either side of the wagon road, and the shadows in the morning were deep and blue, and the stone glowed when the sun found it. Grace had made this journey once before, in the opposite direction, and she remembered the particular beauty of this landscape, the way you remember something that hurt you, with a complicated affection. It was mid-morning on the second day when she heard the horse approaching from behind, and she turned to find that he had closed the distance, riding up alongside the wagon rather than maintaining his customary trailing position. She kept her eyes forward and her hands steady on the reins. "There are reports of the Cutter gang working this stretch of trail," he said without preamble, pulling even with her seat. "I want to be closer." "I didn't ask for your protection," she said. "I know. I don't need a Marshal riding shotgun on my wagon like I'm some stagecoach carrying payroll." "No," he said. "You're considerably more valuable than payroll." He said it with no particular inflection, as if it were a simple statement of fact rather than a compliment, and somehow that made it worse. She looked at him then, which was a mistake, because up close in the morning light he was difficult to look away from. Not because of any single feature, but because of the whole of him, the attention in his eyes, the set of his mouth, the way he held himself on that horse as if he had made a specific decision about where he was going and had not yet found a reason to change it. "You followed me out of Redhorn without permission," she said. "No law against following a public road. You made camp within sight of mine. No law against that either. Who gave you the authority to decide that I needed protecting?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Nobody. I decided it myself." He paused. "I'm aware that doesn't answer your concern." "It doesn't," she agreed. "Would it help if I explained that I passed through this same stretch 3 weeks ago and found the remains of a camp where someone had been attacked? A woman traveling alone." She made it barely. "The Cutter gang is not careful about who they target, Miss Ellery. They hit 2 homesteads before the one in Redhorn, and both families had men with them." Grace was quiet for a moment. She knew about the attacks. Everyone in Redhorn knew. She had factored the risk into her decision to travel, and had concluded that the 60 miles between Redhorn and Millhaven could be covered quickly enough. That staying in Redhorn another month waiting for company was not a viable option. She was not reckless. She was calculated. "I can handle myself," she said. "I believe you," he said, and she could hear that he meant it, which was not what she had expected. "I've watched you handle yourself for 2 days. You're competent, careful, and you read the terrain better than most men I've ridden with." "This isn't about your competence." "Then what is it about?" He looked at her directly, and there was something in his expression that was not quite comfortable, as if he were about to say something that cost him something to say. "It's about the fact that one competent woman on a wagon is still one person against a gang of 8 riders, and the arithmetic of that doesn't work in your favor regardless of how capable you are." Grace turned that over in her mind. It was a reasonable answer. She had been prepared for something condescending, something patronizing, some version of the assertion that women needed protection because they were women, which was the argument she had been fighting her entire life, and which she had more patience for when it came from men who had also watched her outwork, outthink, and outlast 3 seasons of drought, 2 runaway cattle, and a winter that had taken half the livestock in the territory. "You're not wrong," she said finally, which was the hardest sentence she had spoken in recent memory. Something shifted in his expression, very briefly, something that might have been surprise. "Thank you for saying so. Don't make it a habit. I'm still not inviting you to ride beside me." "I noticed." "Good." He fell back to his customary position, and Grace returned her attention to the trail ahead, and the morning advanced around them. It was late that afternoon, the second afternoon, when the wheel broke, and the riders appeared on the horizon simultaneously. And Grace looked up to find Bennett Navarro riding hard toward her with his revolver drawn, and his expression stripped of everything except focused urgency. She climbed down from the wagon seat. She would think about that decision later, in the careful accounting she kept of her own choices, and she would identify it as the moment when something fundamental shifted, not dramatically, not with any particular flourish, but with the quiet finality of a lock turning. He worked on the wheel with the speed and precision of a man who had repaired wheels in worse circumstances than this. And he directed her once to the wagon's toolbox, where a spare iron tire was secured with rope, and she retrieved it without comment and handed it to him without comment, and they worked together in a silence that felt nothing like the hostile quiet of the preceding 2 days. The riders had stopped on the ridge above them, 4 men watching. Bennett didn't look up from the wheel. "Don't acknowledge them," he said quietly. "Keep working. I want them to see a man and a woman making repairs together, nothing more. Don't give them a reason to come down." "Are they going to come down anyway? Depends on how many they think they can take," he said. "They know I'm a marshal. I've had dealings with 2 of those men before. If they think the odds favor them, they'll move. How many bullets do you have?" "Enough." He glanced up at her briefly. "Do you shoot reasonably well?" "There's a rifle under the seat." She moved to retrieve it with a casualness that was entirely performed, stepping up onto the wagon seat as if checking something inside the canvas cover. And she brought the rifle down along her body and stepped back down and positioned herself at the wagon's rear, facing away from the riders with the rifle held loosely, naturally, in a way that would read from the ridge as something other than what it was. The silence stretched. The afternoon wind moved through the canyon. One of the riders on the ridge said something to another, and the sound of their voices reached the canyon floor in fragments, too distant to interpret. Then, slowly, they turned their horses and rode back over the ridge and disappeared. Grace let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Bennett worked for another 20 minutes on the wheel, and when he stood and examined his work and declared it sound, he looked at her with an expression that was still controlled but not entirely closed, and she thought she could see something working behind those eyes, something that was trying to decide whether to become visible. "That was good thinking," he said. "With the rifle, you're the one who told me it was there. You knew what to do with the information. Not everyone would have." She almost said something sharp and deflecting, because sharp deflection was her primary social skill, but she stopped herself because she was tired, and the adrenaline was fading, and something about the way he was looking at her made the sharp thing feel dishonest. "Thank you," she said instead. "For the wheel." "We should keep moving," he said. "Make another 5 miles before dark. There's a settlement at Copper Springs, decent people. You'll be safe there tonight." "We," she repeated. He paused, caught by the word. "You," he corrected. "I meant you'll be safe there." "Is that what you meant?" He held her gaze for a moment, and something in the exchange felt dangerously close to honesty. "No," he admitted. "I meant we." She considered that. She considered him, the marshal who had followed her wagon for 2 days without permission and without apology, who had fixed her wheel and faced down 4 outlaws and said what he meant when she pushed him on it. She thought about Daniel, who had been kind but vague, who had never quite committed to the land or to her or to any of the hard, specific things that life in this territory demanded. She thought about loneliness and what it did to a person's architecture over time. "Then keep up," she said, and climbed back onto the wagon seat. She did not look back to see whether he was smiling. She could tell from the sound of his horse falling into step behind her that he was. Copper Springs was less a settlement than a gathering of intentions. 3 buildings and a corralled livestock area, and a well that worked, presided over by a couple named Walt and Lorna Hargrove, who had been living in this canyon for 11 years, and who received travelers with the practiced hospitality of people who understood that human company was a luxury in this landscape and should be treated accordingly. Lorna Hargrove was a sharp-eyed woman of about 50 who took in Grace's arrival and Bennett's arrival with equal and separate attention, and offered them supper without any commentary on the arrangements, except to say that she had a room for the lady and the Marshal could sleep in the barn. Bennett accepted this without complaint. Grace accepted the room with genuine gratitude, and what she recognized as a degree of disappointment she had no intention of examining. They ate at the Hargroves' table, the four of them, and the conversation was easy and practical, covering trails and weather and the news from both directions along the route. Walt Hargrove had heard about the Cutter gang activities and confirmed that at least 2 of the 8 riders were currently working this corridor. He gave Bennett information about specific camps that travelers had reported seeing. Bennett listened with the focused attention he brought to everything, asking precise questions, building a picture. Grace watched him across the table and thought about how different he was from what she had first assumed. She had marked him initially as another controlling man with a badge who had decided a woman needed supervision, and that assessment had been built on fair historical evidence because she had encountered many such men. But he had not behaved that way. He had been direct about his reasons. He had respected her capabilities, even while asserting that those capabilities had limits. He had corrected himself when she caught him slipping into proprietary language. These were not behaviors she associated with the category she had put him in, and the category was therefore wrong, and she was honest enough with herself to admit when her categories were wrong. After supper, while Lorna was clearing the table and Walt was seeing to the animals, Grace stepped outside and stood in the warm evening air, looking at the sky above the canyon walls, which was deep violet and scattered with more stars than any person raised in a city would believe was possible. She had been in the desert long enough that this sky felt like home in a way that the Missouri sky never had. She heard him come out behind her. She did not turn. "You're 2 years in this territory," he said. "Were they what you expected when you came?" She considered the question seriously, which was her habit with questions that deserved it. "No," she said. "They were harder and better at the same time. The harder part is obvious. The better part is harder to explain. Try." She glanced at him, and he was looking up at the same sky she had been looking at, standing close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cooling evening air, not close enough to be presumptuous. "I learned what I was actually capable of," she said. "You don't know that about yourself until you have to find out. I would have preferred to find out some other way, honestly, but I know it now and I wouldn't trade that." He was quiet for a moment. "That's how I describe most of what this work has taught me." "Is it the work you expected?" "When I took the commission, yes. What I didn't expect was how much of it was waiting and watching and trying to prevent things rather than respond to them. I thought it would be more action. I'm glad I was wrong." "You don't like action. I like quiet better," he said simply. "There's less damage to clean up after." She found that she believed him. There was nothing in him that suggested a man who sought violence for its own sake, no bravado, no performative toughness. He was simply competent and careful and very, very watchful, and she thought those qualities probably made him very good at his job and possibly made him somewhat lonely, because watchful people often had trouble letting themselves be watched in return. "Why did you really follow me?" she asked. She kept her voice neutral, curious rather than challenging. He turned to look at her then, and the evening light caught the planes of his face and made him look younger and more tired at the same time. "I told you. The Cutter gang, the attacks, the risk. That's the official answer." A pause. "Yes. What's the other answer?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the distinct sense of a man weighing something, calculating the cost of honesty against the cost of evasion, and arriving at a conclusion that surprised him. "When I saw you in Redhorn," he said carefully, "loading your wagon by yourself at first light, I thought you were the most self-possessed person I had seen in this territory in 3 years. And then I found out you were traveling alone through a stretch that I knew was dangerous. And the Cutter gang threat was real and documented, and I made the decision to follow. But if I'm being honest with myself, and I'm trying to be, I would have looked for a reason even if the threat had been smaller. The honesty of it landed differently than she expected. She had anticipated something smoother, something more managed. This was neither. This was a man telling her the truth, with the careful reluctance of someone who had decided the truth was owed and who was paying it like a debt. "That's a very frank thing to say to a woman who keeps telling you to leave her alone," she said. "I know. I apologize if it's unwelcome." "I didn't say it was unwelcome," she said. "I said it was frank." Another silence, this one warmer. The stars wheeled slowly above the canyon walls. A coyote called from somewhere in the darkness, far off and haunting. "My husband died 2 years ago," she said, not because it was a natural next statement, but because it felt important that he know the landscape she was walking in. "We came out here together. He was a good man. He didn't last. I think some people are built for this kind of country and some aren't, and there's no shame in it. But I did not know that about him before we came, and I couldn't have known it." "I'm sorry," Bennett said, and she could hear that he meant the words rather than simply performing them. "I don't want sympathy for it," she said, not sharply, just clearly. "I'm telling you because it's part of who I am now, and I have a strong aversion to people who don't know who they're dealing with. That's fair. I'm very independent," she continued, "sometimes to my own detriment. My sister says I've built myself a fortress and am very comfortable in it. She's not wrong. The fortress hasn't looked completely comfortable from where I've been watching," he said quietly. She turned to look at him, and he met her gaze steadily, and there was nothing in his expression except a careful, genuine attention that she found more unsettling than any declaration could have been. "No," she admitted, "it hasn't been, especially lately." They stood in the cooling evening for a little while longer, not touching, not moving closer, simply existing in proximity to each other in a way that felt already like something more than accidental. And then Grace said good night and went inside, and she lay awake in Lorna Hargrove's spare room for a very long time. In the morning, she found that he had risen before her and started a fire and had coffee ready, which she accepted without comment, and they were on the road before sunrise. And now there was something different in the quality of their shared silence, a warmth where the wall had been, a conscious mutual awareness that neither of them acknowledged directly, and both of them felt in everything they did. The last day's travel to Millhaven took them through country that opened gradually from the canyon walls into wider valley land, the red rock giving way to sage and juniper, and the trail widened and showed more signs of recent traffic, the hoofprints and wheel marks of a working route rather than an isolated passage. The Cutter gang threat was real and present, and Bennett maintained his watchfulness, scanning the ridgelines and the draws, but the riders did not appear again. He rode beside her for most of that final day, and they talked in the way people talk when they have decided to let themselves be curious about each other, with genuine interest and no particular agenda. She told him about Missouri, about her family there, her father who had been a farmer and her mother who had been a reader and had filled their house with books, and thus given Grace a relationship with language and ideas that had survived everything the territory had thrown at her. She told him about teaching, about how she had done it briefly in Missouri before the marriage and before the migration, and how she missed it with a specific physical longing, the way you miss something that is also a function. He told her about New Mexico, about his father's ranch outside of Santa Fe, about learning to ride before he could read properly, about his mother's insistence on both his education and his ability to make bread, which she had told him would serve him better than any gun in the long run. He had doubted her for years and had been slowly and continuously proven wrong. He told her about how he had become a marshal, not dramatically, not through any single precipitating event, but through a gradual recognition that the kind of attention he paid to the world was most useful in a role where preventing harm was the primary function. "Do you plan to stay in Utah Territory?" she asked, and she kept her voice neutral enough that the question could mean several different things. "I hadn't planned that far ahead," he said, which she thought was probably true and probably also diplomatic. He glanced at her. "I've been reconsidering the question recently." She did not ask him to elaborate. She understood the implication well enough, and elaborating on it felt premature, like trying to name a thing before you were certain of its shape. They arrived at Millhaven in the late afternoon of the third day, the sun behind them throwing long shadows across the wide main street of what was, Grace saw with a complicated relief, exactly the kind of town Clara's letters had described. Solid, functional, alive. There was a church at one end of the main street and a courthouse at the other, and between them were the full range of commercial and civic establishments that constituted a working settlement in 1879. A general store, a hotel, a livery, a doctor's office, a barber shop, the schoolhouse Clara had mentioned, sitting on its own small plot with an air of gentle expectancy. Clara was on the porch of her house when the wagon turned onto her street, because Clara had been informed by the express rider, who had come through that morning, that her sister was on the road and close. She came down the porch steps with the forward momentum of a woman who had been waiting and would now permit herself to stop waiting, and she embraced Grace with a fierceness that made Grace briefly close her eyes. "You're here," Clara said. "You're finally here." "I'm here," Grace agreed. Clara stepped back and looked at her sister, and then looked past her at the man on the gray horse, who had drawn up at a respectful distance from the reunion. Clara had dark eyes and a sharp face that was kinder than Grace's and equally intelligent, and those eyes moved from Bennett to Grace and back to Bennett with an expression of entirely unconcealed interest. "This is Marshal Navarro," Grace said, with a deliberate casualness that she suspected was entirely transparent to her sister. "He was traveling this direction and we shared the road." "For how long?" Clara asked. 3 days, Bennett said, and Grace noticed that he did not embellish or minimize it, and that he met Clara's scrutiny with a straightforward equanimity that she thought indicated either genuine confidence or excellent manners, and possibly both. 3 days, Clara repeated, looking at her sister. Grace maintained her expression with some effort. "Well, Marshal Navarro, you'll stay for supper." It was not quite a question. Bennett looked at Grace, who gave him a look that could have meant several things, and he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Larimer, that's very kind." Clara's husband, Henry Larimer, was a carpenter and an amiable man who had built half the furniture in Millhaven and most of the goodwill, and he welcomed Bennett to his table with no ceremony, and a plate piled high, and a stream of comfortable conversation that required nothing complicated from anyone. He told Bennett about Millhaven's recent growth, the new families that had come in the past 2 years, the courthouse that had finally been properly completed, the school that had been without a teacher for 6 months, and was the subject of considerable community discussion. "Your sister is going to solve that problem," Henry told Grace with satisfaction. "I told the school board she was coming and 3 of them wept. The 4th one just looked relieved." Grace smiled, and the smile was real, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for a very long time. After supper, Clara established that Bennett would stay in the room above the livery, which the livery owner, a man named Price, rented to travelers, and she said this in a tone that made it clear that arrangements were being made and that was final. Bennett accepted this with the same equanimity he had brought to everything about the past 3 days, which Grace was beginning to think was not a performance, but simply his actual nature. He found her briefly before he left for the livery, while Clara was occupied with Henry in the kitchen, and he stood in the doorway of Clara's sitting room with his hat in his hands, and that contained watchful presence that Grace had stopped finding irritating approximately 48 hours ago. "I'll call on you tomorrow," he said. "If that's acceptable, it's acceptable," she said, and hated how much she meant it. "Good night, Miss Ellery." "Good night, Marshal Navarro." He left, and Grace sat in Clara's comfortable sitting room surrounded by the evidence of her sister's built life, the photographs and the quilts and the children's drawings on the wall, for the children were in bed asleep, 2 of them, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, and Grace looked at all of it and felt the future as a physical thing, pressing forward against the present with quiet insistence. Clara appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that she was not even trying to moderate. "Tell me," she said simply. "There is nothing to tell," Grace said. "I have been your sister for 27 years, Clara said, sitting down and handing over the coffee. "There is something very substantial to tell," Grace sipped her coffee. "He followed my wagon for 3 days to make sure I arrived safely. That is the whole of it, the whole of it." "Yes, Grace." "What? You haven't looked that way since before you left Missouri?" "I don't know what way you mean." "Like there's someone in the world worth looking at," Clara said, with the direct kindness of a woman who loved her sister too much to be anything but honest. Grace was quiet for a long moment, holding the warm coffee cup in both hands, looking at the fire. Then she said, "He's worth looking at." Clara smiled and said nothing more about it, which was either exceptional restraint or perfect tactical patience, and the evening wound down gently around them. In the days that followed, Bennett Navarro did what he had said he would do, which was call on Grace, and he did it with the same directness and absence of game playing that had characterized everything else about him. He came to Clara's house in the late morning, hat in hand, and asked if Miss Ellery would like to walk, and Grace said yes with a composure that was increasingly difficult to maintain, and they walked. Millhaven was a good town for walking. The main street had a boardwalk on both sides, and beyond the courthouse, there was a stretch of cottonwood trees along a creek that ran through the eastern edge of town, and beyond that the country opened up into the sage and juniper landscape that Grace had already come to feel was hers in some essential way. They walked through all of these spaces, and they talked. They talked about everything and about specific things. They talked about the law and its limitations in the territory, which Bennett discussed with a candor that surprised her, acknowledging the injustices that a system built by, and for one kind of person necessarily created, the ways in which the land itself had been taken, and the people who had lived on it for generations had been pushed aside, and how wearing a marshal's badge did not make you separate from that history, only responsible for how you moved within it. She found this self-awareness rare enough to be remarkable. They talked about education and what it could do for people who had been denied it, and Bennett listened to her talk about teaching with an attention that was not polite interest but genuine fascination, asking questions that showed he had been actually hearing what she said rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. They talked about the land itself, about what they both loved about this particular corner of the world, the light and the scale and the demanding beauty of it, and they found they agreed on almost everything about it and disagreed productively about the rest. She introduced him to her new colleagues on the school board, 2 women and a man who were responsible for securing a teacher and who were delighted with Grace's credentials, and even more delighted, She noticed with some amusement, with the Marshal she appeared to have acquired somewhere on the road. The town of Millhaven observed their courtship with the benevolent attention of a community that had a limited entertainment budget. One afternoon, a week after Grace's arrival, Bennett had been about to call on her when he was summoned urgently to the Marshal's office, where Millhaven's sitting Marshal, a man named Olin Briggs, who was technically Bennett's territorial colleague, had received word that 2 of the Cutter gang had been spotted 15 miles east of town. Bennett spent 3 days in the field with Briggs and a deputy, and during those 3 days, Grace taught her first week at the schoolhouse and found, as she had always known she would, that the work fit her like something that had been waiting for her to come back to it. She also found, to her considerable irritation, that she was aware of his absence in a way that was specific and physical, like a note that should have been in a chord and wasn't. She prepared lessons in the evenings and read the books she had brought in her wagon crates and had supper with Clara and Henry and played with the children. And she was fine. She was absolutely fine. She was not waiting, and if she glanced toward the main street from the schoolhouse window with more frequency than strictly necessary, that was simply the natural vigilance of a woman who had spent 2 years in isolated country and had not yet adjusted to the rhythms of a town. When he came back, he was dusty and tired and had a cut along his jaw that someone had bandaged imprecisely, and he came to Clara's house in the early evening and knocked at the door, and when Grace opened it, he looked at her for a long moment and then said, "We got 2 of them. The others went south. I think they're done with this corridor. Are you all right?" she asked, looking at the bandaged cut. "It's minor." "That's not what I asked." He met her eyes, and something in his expression shifted. Something that had been held back came a little closer to the surface. "I'm better now," he said quietly. She stepped aside and let him in, and he sat at Clara's kitchen table while Grace made coffee and Clara and Henry managed to find pressing business in other rooms. And he told her about the 3 days, and she told him about the school. And outside the window, Millhaven went about its evening business in the blue and gold light of a Utah sunset. "I need to give you a full accounting," he said eventually, when the coffee was gone and the light outside had turned to dark. He was looking at the table, choosing words with visible care, and Grace watched him and said nothing because she recognized the particular quality of this silence. "I've been spending a great deal of time in this town for a man whose jurisdiction runs from here to Redhorn." "You have," she agreed. "I want to be honest with you about why, although I think you already know." "I might have some idea," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said, looking up at her, and the directness of it was so characteristic of him and so at odds with the elaborate ritual of indirection that courtship usually demanded that she found herself momentarily without a response. "If you're willing. I'm aware that you have just arrived here and are building something important, and I have no intention of assuming that, because I followed your wagon for 3 days, that I have any claim on your time or attention. But I would like to have claim on it, if you'll give it." Grace looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the fortress her sister had named, the architecture of self-sufficiency she had built stone by stone over 2 years, the careful distance she maintained between herself and the possibility of needing anyone. She thought about how that distance had been shrinking steadily since the moment he had taken the other end of a heavy crate without being asked. She thought about how tired she was of the fortress, and how she had not known she was tired of it until someone had knocked at the door. "I'm willing," she said, "on the condition that you continue to be as honest as you just were." "I've never been much good at anything else," he said, and she believed him. The formal courtship of Grace Ellery and Bennett Navarro was, by the standards of Millhaven, both swift and entirely proper, and by any other standard was one of the more honest and interesting things that had happened in that town in several years. He was present when his duties allowed, and when he was not present he wrote, and his letters were worth reading, direct and warm and occasionally funny in a dry way that she found entirely to her taste. She wrote back with the same directness, and the exchange of letters built something between them that was solid and well articulated, the kind of foundation you could actually stand on. He met her students, who were charmed by him with a thoroughness that Grace found both gratifying and vaguely amusing. He sat in the back of the schoolroom one afternoon and listened to her teach a lesson on geography and the history of the Western Territories, and she was aware of him there with every part of herself, but taught the lesson cleanly, without self-consciousness. And when the students had gone home, he told her it was the best teaching he had ever witnessed, and she understood that he knew enough about the subject to make the assessment meaningful. She met the people in his life in the territory, the other Marshals, the townspeople of Redhorn who had known him for 3 years, and who regarded him with the particular affection of people for whom reliable competence has become a form of affection in itself. She met his deputy in Redhorn, a young man named James who hero-worshipped Bennett with a transparency that made Bennett visibly uncomfortable and Grace privately delighted. One evening in late October, 3 months after Grace had arrived in Millhaven, she and Bennett were walking along the creek path in the blue dusk of a cooling evening, and he stopped walking and she stopped beside him. And when she looked at him, his face was open in a way she had rarely seen it, all the careful management set aside. "I have something I need to tell you," he said, "about my past. I've been carrying it and I think you should know it before this goes further." "Then tell me," she said, because she had always found courage in directness. He told her about a woman he had been engaged to 7 years ago in New Mexico. Her name had been Alma, and they had been together for 2 years, and the engagement had been real and intended, and she had died of typhoid fever 3 months before they were to be married. He told her about the years after, how he had closed himself against the possibility of loss by closing himself against connection, how the Marshal's work had suited that closed version of himself very well because it demanded vigilance and practicality and provided constant forward motion. He told her that he had not expected to meet anyone who made him want to open again, and that the experience of wanting it had been, initially, alarming. "Is it still alarming?" she asked. "A little," he admitted. "Less than it was." "I lost someone too," she said. "I know it's different what I lost and what you lost, but I know about closing against the possibility. I know about the architecture of it." "Fortress," he said, and she heard that he remembered her sister's word. "Fortress," she agreed. "I think we're both standing outside the wall." He reached over and took her hand, and it was the first time he had reached for her deliberately, and the warmth of it moved through her with a clarity that she thought was probably the truest thing she had felt in years. She held his hand and they stood by the creek while the sky darkened around them and the first stars emerged above the canyon walls in the east, and she thought that this was what it felt like when the fortress gate came open from the inside. Not a breach, not a surrender, but a choice. He proposed on a clear December morning on the front steps of the schoolhouse, which was where they had gotten into the habit of meeting on the days he was in Millhaven. And he did it with a ring that had belonged to his mother, a small turquoise set in silver that was beautiful and modest and exactly right. And he did it without elaborate ceremony, looking at her steadily with those dark eyes and saying, "Grace, will you marry me? I'll stay here if you want me here. I'll work this territory for as long as you want to be in it and go where you go if you go elsewhere. You are the thing I want most to build toward." She looked at him on those schoolhouse steps with the December sky pale and bright above them and said, "Yes." and he slid the ring onto her finger, and she looked at it against her hand and felt the future pressing forward again, but warmly this time, like sunlight rather than pressure. They were married in February, in Millhaven's church, which was a wooden building that held 70 people and was full to the rafters because the entire town had a proprietary interest in this particular love story and intended to witness it properly. Clara cried. Henry shook Bennett's hand with both of his. The school board attended collectively. James the deputy rode 60 miles from Redhorn because wild horses would not have stopped him. Grace wore a dress that Clara had helped her make from fabric bought at the general store, a deep blue wool that was practical and beautiful at once. She wore her hair up with the small silver combs that had been her mother's, and she stood at the front of that full church and looked at the man beside her with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who had done the calculation and was satisfied with the result. "I will love you," she said when the moment came, because the Reverend's script had suggested something more elaborate and she had revised it to what she actually meant. "I will be honest with you. I will be your partner in every real sense, and I will tell you when I think you're wrong." There was laughter in the church. Bennett's mouth curved with something that was warmer than any of his previous expressions. "I will love you," he said. "I will be honest with you even when it's difficult. I will follow you wherever you lead, though I've learned you prefer to lead yourself, which I respect and intend to continue respecting." More laughter. "And when you think I'm wrong, I'll try to actually listen." The Reverend pronounced them married, and Bennett kissed her, and the church erupted and Clara cried harder, and James the deputy whooped from the back row and was shushed by 3 people simultaneously. Millhaven gave them a small house on the edge of town that had been empty for a year, a wooden frame structure with a good roof, and a kitchen that wanted work, and a front porch that looked east toward the first light of morning. Bennett and Grace worked on the house together in the weeks after the wedding, and this turned out to be illuminating in ways they had not anticipated, because they discovered that they had very different opinions about how to hang shelves and nearly identical opinions about everything else, and the shelf disagreement became a running joke that would last for years. Bennett continued his marshal's work, but negotiated with the territorial office to anchor himself in Millhaven, taking on the broader district supervision that Olin Briggs had been looking to hand off, which gave him a base and a territory, and kept him in proximity to Grace in the way that both of them needed and neither of them was embarrassed to admit they needed. Grace taught, and it filled her in the deep, specific way that work you are made for fills you, and her students thrived, and word of her teaching moved through the community in the organic way that genuine quality always does. And by the spring, she had 3 more students than the schoolhouse had seats and had petitioned the school board for expansion, which the school board granted with the alacrity of people who had already been planning it. Spring came to Millhaven with the particular southwestern extravagance of a season that had earned itself through the rigors of winter, and Grace found it with a kind of expansiveness she had not felt in years. She rode out with Bennett on Sunday afternoons, because he had quietly presented her with a horse, a steady bay mare named Current, as a wedding gift, and the gift had been perfect enough that she had been briefly unable to speak. They rode out into the country together, into the sage and juniper, into the red rock and the open sky, and the land that had always been hers in some essential way became theirs, together, in a way that she found continually and quietly astonishing. He told her things in those Sunday afternoon rides that he had told no one or very few people. He told her about the parts of his work that were genuinely difficult, the cases where the law and the justice were not the same thing, the compromises that the territory's particular political and social realities imposed, the ways in which the system he served had been, and continued to be used against people who had no recourse within it. He did not speak about these things as if they were abstract problems. He spoke about them with the weight of someone who understood that he was part of the system, even while he tried to exercise his part of it as well as possible. She told him things she had told almost no one. She told him about the grief of Daniel's death, which had been more complex than simple loss, because their marriage had been two people trying their best with incomplete information about themselves and each other, and the grief had contained things other than sorrow. She told him about the loneliness of the 2 years after, not the loneliness of being alone, which she had managed, but the loneliness of having no one to talk to about the things that actually mattered to her. She told him that she had not known how hungry she was for exactly this, these conversations on horseback in the wide afternoon, until they existed. "You talk better than anyone I've ever known," he told her once, and the compliment was so specific and so accurately aimed that she thought it was probably the best thing anyone had ever said to her. In late summer, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days, not from uncertainty or fear, but from the need to have it be entirely real to her before she made it shared. When she told Bennett she had chosen an evening when they were sitting on their front porch, watching the last light leave the eastern sky, and she said it simply, and watched his face. He was still for a moment in a way that was different from his usual stillness, and then he turned to look at her with an expression so open that it made her chest ache. All the careful management simply gone, replaced by something that was entirely unguarded and entirely glad. He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had taken it the first time by the creek, with that deliberate warmth, and he held it and didn't say anything for a moment because he was clearly working out how to say what he meant. "This is," he started and stopped and tried again. "You are the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to me," he said, which was not what he had been going to say, but which was, she thought, exactly what he meant. "The baby will probably be very stubborn," she told him. "Undoubtedly," he agreed, and his thumb moved over her hand. "Given the available material. I'm less stubborn than I was. You're differently stubborn. You've redirected it." She laughed, which was one of her favorite things to do, and settled against him on the porch while the evening completed itself around them. She taught through most of her pregnancy, because she was not willing to leave her students without a teacher again, and because she was genuinely well, her constitution being one of the things that the territory had tested and confirmed. The school board exchanged worried glances and said nothing, because they had learned early that Grace Ellery, now Grace Navarro, made her own decisions about her own life, and the best thing you could do was ensure the outcome was as good as possible. Bennett, who had spent 3 years in his Marshal's work, maintaining a careful professional distance from the personal lives of people he served, discovered in this period that he was constitutionally incapable of maintaining that distance in his own home. He was attentive without being overbearing, which was a balance he achieved through visible effort, and which Grace appreciated precisely because she could see that it cost him something, that his instinct was to protect more than she wanted to be protected, and he was managing that instinct out of respect for her. She told him once that she could see him doing it, and that it was one of the things she loved most about him, and he had looked at her with that startled openness he occasionally produced and said, "Most people would just want the protection. Most people haven't spent 2 years proving to themselves they don't need it," she said. Their son was born in March of 1881, in the small house with the good roof, attended by Millhaven's doctor and by Clara, who had been present at the birth of her own children and whose presence Grace had specifically requested. It was a long labor and not an easy one, and Bennett spent the early hours of it on the front porch with a set expression that Henry, who had joined him in solidarity, described privately to Clara afterward as the most controlled panic he had ever observed. The baby arrived at dawn, healthy and loud, with dark hair and an expression of profound indignation at the state of the world outside. Grace, exhausted and flooded with the particular exhilaration of having done something enormous, held him against her chest while the morning light came through the east-facing window, and thought that this was the furthest possible thing from a fortress, this boundless openness, this willingness to love something so completely vulnerable. Bennett was allowed in 15 minutes after the birth, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Grace with the baby, and his face was so unguarded, so stripped of everything except the purest form of gladness, that Clara had to look away for a moment because she felt she was witnessing something too private for witnesses. He sat on the edge of the bed and Grace put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the careful, intentional steadiness he brought to everything. And he looked down at this new person and then up at Grace and said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "Thank you." "You don't thank someone for this," she said. "I'm going to anyway." They named him Thomas Daniel Navarro, the second name for Grace's late husband, which was Bennett's suggestion, made quietly and without pressure. And Grace had looked at him when he suggested it with an expression that she could not have described, and that she thought contained several things simultaneously: grief and gratitude, and love of a depth that surprised her with its arrival. Thomas Daniel was, as predicted, stubborn from the first breath, and loud and interested in everything and the delight of the house. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's precise, evaluating attention, and by the time he was pulling himself upright on the furniture, the combination of these qualities had already convinced both parents that he was going to be absolutely exhausting, and they could not imagine anything better. The Cutter gang, what remained of it after the arrests in the East Corridor, was apprehended in full in the spring of 1881, through a coordinated action involving 3 territorial marshals and a deputy sheriff from Nevada. The men were taken to the territorial courthouse and tried, and received sentences that Bennett privately thought were inadequate and publicly acknowledged were the best the current system would produce. He wrote a detailed report on the case, including recommendations for changes to the territorial law that would make prosecution of organized gangs more effective, and sent it to the territorial governor's office, and was mildly surprised when several of the recommendations were eventually incorporated into law. He had a reputation, by this point, that had spread along the corridor in both directions from Millhaven, not the dramatic frontier reputation of the dime novel Marshal, but the quieter and more durable reputation of a man who could be trusted to do what he said, and to see the larger picture, and to exercise his authority with both competence and judgment. It was the kind of reputation that attracted good deputies, and he found in those years that he was being sought out by young men who wanted to learn the work the right way, and he took this seriously, teaching with the same patient, principled attention that Grace brought to her students, and occasionally comparing notes with her on the pedagogy of it, which she found hilarious and accurate. 2 years after Thomas Daniel's arrival, in the late summer of 1883, Grace told Bennett she was pregnant again. She told him in the morning this time, over coffee, and he received the news with the same unguarded gladness he had brought to the first, though this time he didn't need as long to find the words. "I'm very glad," he said, and took her hand across the kitchen table and looked at her with the full warmth of a man who had learned, carefully and against his original nature, to be as present as he was watchful. "Are you well? Completely," she said. "Are you still going to teach until a week before the birth?" "Yes," I assumed. "I've already told the school board to have a plan. Without asking me, I told them you'd have a plan and they should be ready to support it. Is that better? She considered this. Yes, actually. The second child arrived in early 1884. A girl, born on a cold February morning with the same dawn light through the east window, and the same combination of exhaustion and exhilaration on Grace's part, and controlled panic and eventual unguarded joy on Bennett's. They named her Ruth Clara Navarro, the second name for Grace's sister, who cried when she heard it in a way that was different from her usual crying, deeper and more grateful. Thomas Daniel, who was 3 years old and had very strong opinions about everything, examined his new sister with the evaluating precision that was entirely his mother's, and announced that she was very small, and he had been expecting something different. Bennett, who had spent 3 years in the territory before his marriage and 12 years of marriage learning to navigate the distance between what he expected and what actually occurred, told his son that this was a feeling he would get used to. Ruth Clara was quieter than her brother, more observational, with a patience that belonged to neither parent and possibly skipped generations. And she had Grace's precise, analytical intelligence and Bennett's watchful stillness, which was a combination that would serve her extremely well throughout her life, and currently manifested as an infant who regarded the world with a calm attention that made people feel slightly examined. Clara declared her the most perceptive baby she had ever met, which Bennett found mildly alarming and Grace found entirely characteristic of both her sister and her daughter. The years of the mid-1880s were good ones, in the particular way that good years are good, not dramatically but steadily, with the accumulation of small and large things that constitute a life being built in the right direction. The school grew. Bennett was offered a position with the territorial government that would have moved them to Salt Lake City, and he turned it down after 2 conversations with Grace, in which she made clear that she had built something in Millhaven that she was not prepared to abandon, and he agreed without grievance, because he had also built something and had no more desire to abandon it than she did. They argued sometimes, with the honest vigor of 2 people who had both strong opinions and genuine respect for each other, and the arguments were specific and occasionally fierce, and were always resolved, because neither of them had any patience for the architecture of long grievance, having both lived with the cost of walls. The shelf hanging remained a point of contention for years, and was eventually resolved in Grace's favor when she demonstrated empirically that her method produced straighter results, which Bennett accepted, and Grace did not excessively gloat over, because excessive gloating was not her style, though she permitted herself one extremely controlled moment of satisfaction. Thomas Daniel grew into the kind of child that teachers adore, curious and argumentative and occasionally exhausting, and his first years in his mother's classroom were an experience that Grace described to Bennett as a profound test of her professional objectivity. Thomas had his father's jaw and his mother's vocabulary, and used the combination to considerable effect. Bennett told him once that the best marshals he knew had always been the most curious people in the room, and this was true and also a very calculated thing to say to a boy who was already leaning toward his father's work. And Grace overheard it, and told Bennett later that she thought it was slightly manipulative and very effective, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it. Ruth Clara took to books the way her grandmother had, with a consuming, comprehensive enthusiasm, and the small bookshelf in her bedroom expanded steadily through her childhood as her parents, both of whom had a genuine reverence for books and no capacity to deny a child access to them, supplied her with everything she wanted to read. Grace read with her in the evenings, both of them with their books, in the easy shared silence that reading requires, and these evenings were among Grace's most precious things. Millhaven grew. New families arrived, new buildings went up, the courthouse expanded. A second school was eventually established for the children on the far side of town. The couple who had been the subject of so much communal attention and affection became simply a fixed point in the town's life. The marshal and the schoolteacher, the people you went to when you needed either the law or learning, and occasionally both simultaneously. In the autumn of 1887, when Thomas was 6 and Ruth Clara was 3, a woman came to Grace's schoolroom on a Tuesday afternoon with 3 children who spoke no English and who had been traveling for 6 weeks, and who had nowhere to go in Millhaven and no advocate, except the woman who had found them on the road outside of town and recognized a state of emergency. Grace listened to the whole story in the careful way she listened to things, and then she made 4 decisions in rapid succession. The first involving the children's immediate enrollment in her school, the second involving the question of where the family would stay, the third involving the town's charitable apparatus, and the fourth involving the conversation she was going to have with Bennett that evening about what the marshal's office could do to ensure the family's safety and legal standing. Bennett received this conversation with the focus and seriousness it warranted, which was exactly what Grace had expected. It was around this time that Bennett began to talk seriously about the question of what came next in his work, whether to continue in the marshal's role through the shift that statehood was eventually going to produce, or to move towards something else, perhaps the law itself, which had been a secondary interest for years. He was 38, with 15 years in territorial law enforcement and a reputation that gave him options. And Grace listened to him work through this question over many evenings and many conversations, and contributed her own assessment when he asked for it, which was that he was describing someone who had outgrown the current shape of his work and needed a larger container for what he was actually capable of. He stared at her for a moment when she said it. "That's the most clarifying thing anyone has ever said to me about this. You were thinking it. I just described it." "You always just describe it," he said, which was equal parts complaint and compliment, and she received it as both. He began reading law in the evenings, borrowing books from Millhaven's small but growing library, and from a lawyer named Patterson who had moved to town the previous year, and who was glad to have a marshal interested in the theoretical underpinnings of the work rather than just the practical execution. Grace read over his shoulder sometimes, in the way she read everything, and occasionally stopped him to discuss something. And he had the experience he'd had many times in their marriage of discovering that the subject he was studying had acquired new dimensions, because someone with a different and equally sharp intelligence was looking at it alongside him. Thomas Daniel, by this point in his 7th year, had developed a habit of listening to his parents' conversations from the doorway of whichever room they were in, not surreptitiously but overtly, simply standing there because he was interested. Bennett had pointed this out to Grace once, and she had said, "He's learning how to have a real conversation. Let him listen." And Bennett had accepted this, as he had learned to accept Grace's assessments of the children, which were consistently more accurate than his own, not because he loved them less, but because she saw them more clearly, having spent more time in close quarters with them, and having also a particular gift for seeing people as they actually were rather than as you needed them to be. Ruth Clara, at 3, had already developed what the family privately called the look, an expression of patient, evaluating attention that her mother deployed in the classroom when a student was saying something that might be either very good or very wrong, and she was waiting to find out which. Bennett had pointed out the family resemblance to Grace with some amusement. Grace had pointed out that Bennett did the exact same thing with his eyes. By 1889, Bennett had passed the territorial bar examination, and had begun taking cases alongside his marshal's duties, working with Patterson on the legal side while he managed the transition of his marshal's position to a successor. The successor was James, his former deputy, who was by now a grown man of 28 with 10 years of experience, and a calm, steady competence that Bennett trusted completely, and who received the transfer of the position with a seriousness and gratitude that was exactly appropriate. Bennett's law practice, begun in that particular way that beginnings in the late frontier West happened, practically and without ceremony, grew steadily through the early 1890s. He had a particular effectiveness in the courtroom that came from the same qualities that had made him effective as a marshal: the watchfulness, the precision, the complete absence of performance, the willingness to say exactly what he meant in exactly the words required. He took cases that needed taking, including some that were not profitable, but that involved the kinds of injustice that he had spent 15 years witnessing the limits of the law to address. And Grace watched him build his practice with the satisfaction of someone who was seeing a person inhabit their fullest shape. She continued to teach. She had no plans to stop teaching. She had been offered, on separate occasions, the positions of school board chair and town librarian, both of which she declined on the grounds that her work was in the classroom, and she was not inclined to administer what she could still do directly. Her students over the years included children who became teachers, lawyers, ranchers, doctors, a newspaper editor, and at least 3 people who became involved in the territorial politics that led eventually to Utah statehood in 1896, which was the subject of considerable discussion in the Navarro household, as it was in every household in the territory. Statehood changed things in the ways that major political events always change things, some of them good, some of them complicated, all of them real. Bennett's practice expanded into the new state's legal framework with the adaptability of someone who had been watching the system evolve for nearly 2 decades. Grace's school became part of the new state's educational system, which brought funding and complications in roughly equal measure, and she navigated both with the practical intelligence that was her primary tool. Thomas Daniel, who was 15 when Utah became a state, had been watching the process with an intensity that suggested he was filing it away for future use. He had his father's jaw and his mother's vocabulary and both parents' habit of paying close attention, and the combination was producing someone who was going to do something interesting with his life, though what exactly was not yet clear. He had talked about law, about ranching, about political office, about teaching, in the shifting way of a person who had many capabilities, and had not yet found the specific thing that claimed them all. Ruth Clara at 12 was reading everything, which remained her primary mode of engaging with the world, and she had her mother's precise, demanding intelligence and her father's patience, and she was going to be, her parents both privately believed, someone who changed the shape of whatever room she was standing in. In the spring of 1896, the spring of statehood, Grace and Bennett sat on their front porch in the evening as they had been sitting on this porch for 15 years, in the particular ease of people who have been together long enough that silence is as comfortable as speech and as full of meaning. The porch looked east, and the light leaving the sky in that direction was the violet and gold of a Utah evening in April, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were in their new leaves, that particular green that is almost luminescent against the red country. 15 years on this porch, Bennett said. More or less, Grace agreed. What would you tell the woman loading her wagon in Redhorn? She considered this seriously, because she gave every question that deserved it the same consideration. That the fortress is an understandable response to the circumstances, she said. and that it becomes a prison if you stay in it too long, and that when someone comes along who is worth letting pass the gate, you will know it, even if you spend the first 2 days trying to drive them away. You spent 4 days, he said. 3, she said firmly. I was there, he said. You're right, she said, because he was right. It had been 4 days counting the morning in Redhorn, and she was not in the habit of denying evidence. 4 days.